Are you here? Well, we thank you for being here, tuned in to episode number 1054 of the Paul Leslie Hour. And joining us today is Robert W. Malone, MD, MS, and Jill G. Malone, PhD, authors of Psy War, Enforcing the New World Order. So what's a Psy War? Well, that's where government coordinates and directs deployment of propaganda, censorship, and psychological operations tools in campaigns designed to manipulate public opinion. Keep in mind, the Paul Leslie Hour is made possible by viewers and listeners like you. So please visit www.thepaulleslie.com/support. And in advance, we thank you. Hey, you're not going to want to miss a word of this interview, so let's listen together.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be joined by Robert W. Malone and Jill G. Malone, authors of Psy War, Enforcing the New World Order. First of all, thank you so much for making the time to speak with us.
Glad to do it.
Thanks for having us on.
Now, it's a very big subject, a very interesting book. What are the biggest consequences of the Psy Wars?
Distrust in government.
That's a big one. When this technology is deployed, and it has been actively deployed by Western governments against their own citizens, you find yourself in an information landscape where everything is distorted. And it becomes extremely difficult to discern what is truth and what is manipulated propaganda and falsehood.
And
the tech seeks to control your thoughts and your emotions and your beliefs.
to that end, probably if I was actually the biggest problem with what's happening is the dissolution of democracies. When the government is doing these psyops campaigns against their own people, we no longer have a functioning democracy. So as with Hunter Biden's laptop is the perfect example of, that swung the election. You can say, cheating at the computers, whatever. But when it comes down to it, they would not have been able to overcome that if it hadn't been for those 51 intelligence officers who signed that letter.
Yeah, that's just one very concrete example.
Yeah.
In the case of COVID, which is what really has triggered us to write the book, our own experiences being subjected to this, what it amounted to was that nobody really in the general population was able to get informed consent. They were not able to access true and accurate information. All they received was propaganda, carefully crafted under the logic that any information that would cause them to become vaccine hesitant must be suppressed and counteracted. So all of us were bombarded by a constant stream of carefully crafted propaganda messaging to convince us that we should accept these products based on the thesis that the vaccine would kill between 3 to 4 of every 100 of us that were infected. I'm sorry, not the vaccine, the virus itself would kill something like 3.4% of all infected people. That itself turns out to have been propaganda, as was shown by the incoming director of NIH, Jai Bhattacharya, early on, who demonstrated that the actual case fatality rate was a fraction of 1%, more like influenza. It was all propaganda, and it was all misinformation and lies, hence the title of our first book, The Lies My Government Told Me.
On the note of the COVID thing, now that some of the dust has settled, in what way has the medical community, your peers, has there been any change in the way that they have acted towards you?
Over the last 6 months, particularly since the election, there's been some change. People recognize that the old rules no longer apply. In corporate media and in government employees, and to some extent in the medical community, but to a much lesser extent, I've been approached by people that formerly would not have anything to do with me or would attack me, like almost like they're testing the waters. Am I still angry at them? What do I think about this, that, or the other thing? As they're recognizing that I have some voice that the new administration listens to. And of course, they want to be able to influence public policy. So that's what I'm experiencing, is kind of a little bit of a thawing of the ice, never an apology, never any acknowledgement of what's happened, except in the form of, for instance, these various congressional reports that have mentioned my name and what the government has done. But for the most part, just kind of exploratory inquiries.
And those are just individuals. The actual medical community has not changed their position one bit. They're still safe and effective. There were no adverse events. All of the medical journals required, if you published a paper that had anything negative about the mRNA jab, that you would have at the bottom, but still this product is safe and effective and is recommended. That still goes on to a large extent. So the propaganda within the medical journals and the censorship has not gone away.
Of ours, Raphael Laddister, just published a paper. He's down in Australia. He just published a paper in the peer-reviewed journal Curious, explicitly discussing the corruption of the medical literature that's occurred over the last 4 years.
I know a lot of people out there probably see themselves in this seat, and that is, historically, having always trusted and believed that what their doctor tells them is true, they wonder, where do you turn? I find myself increasingly asking that question. I don't know what to believe.
Yeah, we foresaw, frankly, that would be a consequence of what was being done with the propaganda campaign, is it would destroy public confidence in the entire public health enterprise, in vaccines, in the medical enterprise, in hospitals. It is exposed what were pre-existing problems and further exacerbated them, to the point now where many people are actively seeking out physicians that have been contrarians as the only ones that they're willing to trust. And as a consequence, those physicians are having their practices explode. Many of them are unable to keep up with the demand. But we're seeing downturns in vaccine uptake, particularly childhood vaccines. We're seeing pediatricians firing their patients and the patient's parents because they won't comply with the full vaccine schedule.
Over 40% of pediatricians will fire their patients if their patients are not fully compliant, their pediatric patients, with the vaccine schedule. They will fire them.
It's astonishing.
Yeah. It has to do with the financial incentives that they have. They're placed in a situation where they are compensated based on the fraction of their patient population that is fully vaccinated. And so if you have a child that is not fully vaccinated, you put at risk their cash flow for these bonuses that they receive.
As the two of you were writing Psy War, was there a more fascinating revelation or discovery that you all had?
So in general, I think one of the big epiphanies for us was a book by Jeremy Corsi, and I want to say his last name's Merrick, on the JFK assassination, where this man is an MD and a physicist, and he went through and he reanalyzed the autopsies of JFK using modern digital imaging technologies. And clear as a bell, when you go through that book, there were 2 gunshots right here. That for me was kind of a moment where I went, okay, our government has doing psyops campaigns on us since that assassination, and then the wall crumbles down. What else have they lied to us about? And that was, for me, the big moment in writing that book, was just how deep it goes. It's not just vaccines.
Yeah, for me, perhaps the one thing learning about fifth generation warfare and the technology and the role of our military and the British military and intelligence communities, all that's been an amazing journey. But in particular, if you're going to say one thing, one of the people that follows us on Substack pointed me to somebody from down under, New Zealand and Australia, pointed me to a essay interview that was covered in a New Zealand publication, lay press publication, in 2017, so before the COVID crisis, from a former Soviet intelligence person. I think his name is pronounced Alexander Kazimov. He actually wrote the definitive book on the Soviet use of bioweapons in intelligence and propaganda, so for disruption. And he gave this interview in 2017 about bird flu, in which he described a process that he called information bioterrorism. I call it psychological bioterrorism, but he laid down, and we cover it in the book, he laid down a series of steps that are known spycraft that are used by governments all over the world to weaponize the fear of infectious disease, and how it is deployed in order to control and manipulate populations for a wide variety of purposes, including economic disruption. And as I read this interview in which he described the process as standard spycraft, it's well known. And again, this is before the COVID crisis happened, 2017. And he's describing it in the context of bird flu because, of course, we've had multiple prior bird flu events that very closely parallel a lot of the messaging and activities that have occurred during the COVID crisis, but in the case of COVID, in a much larger scale. He described these processes of how academics are used to socialize ideas and get it into low-level literature, and then how that is then gradually amplified into corporate media and snowballed to produce a fear response, and then converted to guide that towards some sort of goal and objective, and then the introduction of some miraculous cure. In our case, it's the vaccine.
He actually brings out that many times this is done by foreign countries or governments for economic destruction of other nations. So some other country will be feeding disinformation or the fear, and for me, in just feeding off of this, Robert, when you look at, I've just been doing a deep dive on what President Trump said at the World Economic Forum, and he is all about, he's going to create this economic driver, AI, crypto, manufacturing, reduce oil costs, reduce inflation, but the driver is going to be the economic engine. The best way to kill that economic engine is for bird flu to make an appearance, where all of a sudden, or some other disease acts. This is the way that the other side can kill Trump.
Can disrupt things. And so one of the things that Kazimov points out is that as you move through this process, again, he's describing standard spycraft.
Yes.
It's well known in his field of spooks, okay, whether it's Soviet Union or domestic US. Yeah. Okay, this is standard spook spycraft. As you move through this and you've trained the population, because we've basically been trained like Pavlov's dogs to respond to a bell signal. Okay, that's what's happened to us, is we've been trained to respond to a fear signal. This is psychological bioterrorism.
How many people do you actually know in your life that have died of flu? How many? And if you do, I bet you dollars to donuts, they were over a certain age.
Yeah.
People that were on death's doorstep.
Right.
So one of the things that Kazimov says is, as this gets resolved and you've achieved whatever your objective is as a spook, to disrupt your enemy, your opponent, then you want to keep the thing alive, like bird flu. You want to keep the population, you want to hold it back.
SARS-CoV-2 is another
example. Want to keep it the awareness of that in the population,
Yeah, it could
so
happen
that
again.
you can redeploy it at some time in the future, because they've already been trained to respond to that stimulus, to that signal. When I read that essay and kind of processed that interview, of processed what that all meant, for me, it blew my mind, because as he's describing this in 2017, I'm reading it in the present and saying, oh yeah, that happened, that happened, that happened, that happened. It followed the script precisely as he laid it out as to enter spycraft. And at that point, for me, I kind of tipped over from, well, maybe it was a conspiracy, to, oh my God, this follows the script precisely.
Right. Now, was it opportunism or was it something else? That's the question. But this is a script, and we fall into it, and it's hard not to. Yeah. And just to say it, with the bird flu right now, we as a nation have never tested cattle. We've never tested wildlife, not just birds, but mammals, pets. Of course, if you've never tested for it and you go look for it, maybe you're going to find it. So again, this is a psyops operation to scare people. And by the way, the regulatory capture, there are companies now making literally billions of dollars off of, basically 60 some people having gotten bird flu, and one who was already had comorbidities dying with bird flu, not of bird flu. So
so bird flu is a great example. Monkeypox was another great example. At one point, they were trying to socialize leprosy in Florida. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
And blame the governor of Florida for a half dozen cases of leprosy, that are largely tied to immigrants coming out of areas in South America where leprosy is endemic. This goes on again and again and again. And it very much relates to that old saw with the press. If it bleeds, it leads. The fear of infectious disease, this psychological bioterrorism, is enormously profitable. It drives clicks, it drives likes, it drives subscriptions, it drives views. People are obsessed with this fear. What it really is the fear of death. And the fear of death being weaponized in order to manipulate people for a wide variety of purposes. Remember, the largest upward transfer of wealth in modern history occurred in the context of the response to COVID.
One of the main news magazines I was reading in bed last night, since you brought up bird flu, and the magazine cover said something about MAGA raw milk craze. And the article, it suggested that, raw milk, it can be dangerous, but that's up to each person's choice, right? Then the article, it says, well, not so fast. It says, with the bird flu, these people who are drinking raw milk, they could be somehow subjecting the general population as a whole to their dietary choice.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
So that there was a study recently published that addressed that directly.
And we already know this, though, but.
So if you unpack that logic, basically it's saying, is bird flu present in raw milk? Well, in fact, it is. That's one of the new findings, is that the udder, the part of the mammary gland of the cow that produces the milk, will support replication of avian influenza. And at some level, it does get shed into milk. So the next question is, if you drink that milk, do you get infected? So they did a study involving monkeys in which they took bird flu virus and they had them eat it in various forms or inhale it. And the inhaling part was a positive control. The monkeys get infected if they inhale it. Okay, if it goes into their oropharynx and nasopharynx and into their upper lungs. And then they had them eat it or drink it, and they didn't get infected. So this is just pure speculation and fear being promoted by the media with no basis because the science actually shows that even if it was in raw milk, and by the way, pasteurization does inactivate it, even if it's there, humans are not at risk for developing bird flu from eating or drinking bird flu present. And by the way, in anything, by the way, influenza, including bird influenza, is present in water. Any water source that has been contaminated by migratory waterfowl, which produce enormous amounts of influenza, will have some degree of influenza in it. Okay? So if you're, we could say the same thing about drinking from a creek or a river or any other standing body of fresh water. It puts you at risk for avian influenza, and so you absolutely shouldn't. I mean, it's the same risk.
Right.
It's just a lie. It's
right.
an absolute lie.
And
It's just, they're just projecting.
So many viruses in the world that is literally impossible to count them all. We're not talking billions, we're talking numbers bigger than billions. And our bodies need to be exposed to these viruses. This is how we train our immune system. It's not by shielding ourselves off from germs, it's by exposing ourselves to germs, particularly children. They need to get out in the dirt. They need to play in the dirt.
Yeah.
They need to be exposed.
Low-level exposure is crucial.
It's low-level exposure is a good thing. And that's how our bodies get a robust immune system. It's not from shielding them from all viruses. It's the exact opposite.
Yeah. So this whole raw milk story smacks of conflict of interest for the dairy industry. Because what's really at stake here is whether or not people will go to an Amish farmer or some local milk producer and purchase raw milk. And historically, the argument has been that if you take raw milk, you're at risk for developing bovine tuberculosis.
Which when they first started saying this, they didn't recognize there was a difference between bovine and human TB. And then once that ended and they recognized that, then they stopped saying it was about TB and then they said it was about listeria. But if you look at the listeria numbers, it rarely comes from, not that it can't come from raw milk, but it usually comes from other sources. So that argument has kind of faded away. But the truth is that pasteurization is done by large collectives of milk. It's a factory basically where milk comes in, they pasteurize, then it can be sold over state borders. It cannot be sold over state borders if it's not been pasteurized. This allows these very large agro-businesses to control milk. Whether this is the regulatory capture that's going on, I don't know, but it's very suspicious. They are fearful of raw milk, not only because of disease, whether or not that's true or not, but because of what it represents to the agribusinesses.
In addition to reading Psy War, I recommend everybody follow you on X. For the first time ever, I had an interview just totally yanked from YouTube. So people will definitely be able to access this on X. What role do you see X having at the present?
Clearly, after Elon, I had been kicked off of Twitter, right, strangely, 2 days before I did the Joe Rogan podcast interview.
Not just Twitter, strangely, almost all the social media platforms kicked you off on the same day, and they would not give a reason why.
Yeah. So we now know there's actually been documentation from some of the congressional hearings that I was targeted by the federal government. But after, and some colleagues of mine, other physicians that have been kicked off, filed a lawsuit against Twitter to try to get reinstated. But they lost in California court. And they had asked me to join that. So I'm tainted as having lost a legal fight against Twitter to get back on after they deplatformed me. But when Elon came in and purchased it, then Jay Bhattacharya and others were allowed basically into Twitter HQ. And the result was the Twitter files and all that disclosure. And shortly after that story developed and started to break, suddenly my Twitter account got turned on. as was the case with a number of others, even though I had lost this lawsuit against Twitter. So I'm very grateful that X, now as it's renamed, has allowed us to be on, but X still censors, and we're still shadow banned to a significant extent. At one point, our account was listed as a spam account, which justified the shadow banning, in part because we post our Substack links. And Twitter has a policy that it doesn't want anybody to go off of X. And so if you post links to an outside source, then you're algorithmically de-emphasized or shadow banned. So that still goes on. It's a little bit less than it once was.
And we really don't know. Elon Musk in November of 23, I want to say, testified in front of the European Union, in which he assured their commission that their policy would be freedom of speech, but not reach. Okay, those are his exact words. And basically, if you're spouting a lot of racist stuff, you're going to be de-emphasized. Your numbers, you're not going to reach that many people. You'll reach your small community. So, but we don't know the details of that, but we do know that X does do that. We don't know, basically what for, or what their algorithms are for.
So by speaking out about public health, about the COVID crisis, about the risks associated with the vaccines, the masks, mandates, et cetera, the bioethics, we have been historically identified as people who should be de-emphasized.
Whether that's still the case, I don't think so.
And if you look at our traffic on X, it appears that something like 3 or 4 months ago, suddenly our traffic on X had an abrupt change. We started, and our subscribers, which had plateaued to basically no change at all, suddenly started slowly increasing. So that's encouraging. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a huge improvement. But X is still not fully free and open in any way.
Well, I know we just have a moment here. How can the average person keep peace in this world that we're in, this world of Psy War?
Sovereignty.
Yeah, and what we argue is decentralization. We discuss, we live it. So we're broadcasting from an old pig barn. It's in the studio in our farm in central Virginia that we basically homesteaded. And we grow some of our own food. We produce animals. We have chickens. We've got a whole bunch of roosters in the freezer.
We buy local meat.
We buy local. We use local labor.
But don't rely on any one source for your information. I mean, that's the truth. Is you've got we who want to stay informed have got to really use a broad platform to get our news, and then also don't spend your life on the internet. Get off of it. Have a local community. Have passions outside of the computer. Whatever it is. For us, it's farming and growing our food and cooking. But for other people, it may be boat building. I don't know. But find community. Get off the internet. Use many sources for your news information, and build a life that is outside of government control.
Remember
one other thing, I'm going to interrupt. Get out of debt.
Mm.
Do not, that is, they control you if you're in debt. You are an indentured servant. Work really hard to get out of debt, and then you're free.
But I was going to say, and in addition to all this, build local community. So Jill mentioned decentralization. Think global, act local. Build friends and family, emphasize your own local network, and build and rely on those relationships. That will sustain you through what I think are going to be rather turbulent times over the next decade or two.
All right. Potent and great words. Thank you both very much. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks
Take
for having
care.
us on.
Thanks.
Our pleasure. All right. Well, you all have a wonderful, wonderful day and stay warm.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have to go work outside.
All right. Until next time.
Okay.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
We thank you and appreciate you dropping in for the Paul Leslie Hour today. You know, you can help the Paul Leslie Hour in our mission to provide independent media content like this by visiting www.thepaulleslie.com/support. We truly thank you. This is your announcer speaking. Performance of The Entertainer intro song and Corina Corina outro song, courtesy of John Primorano. Well, that's it for today. So until next time, be safe and be good.